ask what you can do for your country.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Don McCaig Show. And boy, doesn't that voice resound. And the truth of the pudding is, don't ask what the country is going to do for you. What are you going to do for the country? And I am so honored to have joining us right now Miss Deirdre Henderson from New Hampshire, who is going to give us an interesting event coming up and some of the background of JFK as she was in his employ back in 1959 and before. Deirdre, how are you?
Fine, thank you, Don.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me on.
Oh, I love it. Well, let's start right, if we can, about how did you end up working? You were a research assistant, correct?
That's right.
Yes. And how did you end up being hired? That obviously, he was a senator at the time, correct?
That's right. I have to say that we're talking from Massachusetts, but that's a minor. I'm in Massachusetts.
Oh, okay.
That's
yes.
all right.
Okay.
I like New Hampshire, too.
Yes. All right.
I first met Senator Kennedy in 1954. To be exact, it was June 15th, when I was still in college, and my sister and I had lunch with him. We went to the office, and he took us to lunch in the Senate dining room. And that was when I decided, when I get out of college, I think I want to work for. I had already studied his career quite fully.
Where were you going to college?
I was at at Wells College in New York State, and then I went to Edinburgh University.
Oh, you went to Edinburgh, yes. Well, so how did then?
Then in 1958,
yep.
I asked my brother-in-law to write a letter to his good friend Senator Kennedy, who he knew during World War II, and also when he was at Harvard, and they were good friends. I asked him to write a letter of recommendation. I immediately got a reply, and I went down for an interview. And he hired me to be his research assistant, and ended up, he first wanted me to go to Washington, and I said, Senator, I don't think I'm experienced enough to do that. And then he said, how about writing speeches? I said, Senator, I've only been out of college for a short time, a couple of years, and I had been at Harvard working in the Defense Studies program and going to seminars there with high-end people in the national security field. He then said, I'm going to assign you to my academic advisory group, which was made up of professors from Harvard and MIT mainly. So I was located in his Boston Senate office,
right?
But paid by his father's firm in New York because I wasn't on the Senate staff.
Now, was that the same office that Ted Kennedy used also, Deirdre?
I think there was another one.
Yeah,
it could have been, but I know that the office was empty at the time.
I see.
And he put me in there, and it was a great place to work from because remember there were no fax in those days, and there was no email. But this happened to be the federal building which housed the main post office in Boston. So everything had to be sent down overnight or by telegraph.
So you in other words, now when did it turn into a research?
Well, my job was
position?
from the very beginning was a research.
Oh, okay.
Assistant.
So he would have you go to the library or go to, because like
wherever,
you say,
and mainly go and see the professors.
Oh, I see.
And speak to them, and the job was to prepare with them under their supervision if it was something to do with foreign policy under that. And they sent me around and gave me their books to read, and I prepared, for example, the major paper I wrote under the supervision of Professor Archibald Cox at the law school.
Yes.
He was a wonderful man. And
with the bow ties. Was he wearing bow ties then?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He was a wonderful man. And we wrote a major put together a research paper on foreign policy and defense.
And this was 1958, huh? 58?
No, this would be 1960.
Oh, okay.
59 and 60.
So you were there when the decision was made by Senator Kennedy to run for president, right?
Yes, when he hired me,
Wow.
he said, I'm going to be running for president.
Wow. Isn't that amazing? So now tell me what you did. You stay in Boston during the campaign?
I stayed, but I was called down quite often to Washington when he or Sorensen or somebody else would call me and say, the senator wants you down here. And then I would come down and work there for a while and then come back to Boston again. So that made it very interesting.
Oh, it must have been really,
and
really
the thing that I wanted to point out, which is in the diary catalog, is that he said to me, when you see the need to add any other professors or experts or businessmen to this list, go ahead and do that. And I thought, boy, this is quite a job to be given that responsibility.
Well, now I want to tell our listeners, because I really didn't until I got you on, and one, be correct, and also allow you to obviously interject if something is not as thorough or is not completed. You are the recipient. You were the recipient of JFK's diary that he kept during 1945, post-war. Is that correct?
That's correct.
He gave that diary to you.
That's correct.
And to my knowledge, I think you've told me, that was the only record of him ever keeping a diary. Is that correct?
As far as I know, yes.
Yes. Now, he gave that to you in 1959, was it? Or
1959.
Okay. Now, the family was aware of that?
I don't know.
Okay. But they obviously would have wanted that diary. Is that not correct?
I would assume so. But remember, I was working in a campaign.
Right.
I had no idea that the president would be assassinated.
Oh, of course not.
On November 1963.
Yep.
And the truth is that it was shattering to anyone who was young in those days. All of us were
terrible.
We tried to just put it behind us.
I cried for 3 days. I was up in Amherst, I tell you.
I'm sure.
That's the truth. I cried for 3 days. But now listen, so you have this, and it is going to go to auction on Wednesday, April 26th, which is this coming Wednesday. Is that not
right?
Correct? And it is the R&R Auction Studio
in Boston.
Right. My partner just looked it up because I had not done it, and that's the oldest auction house in Boston, or in Massachusetts, or where?
Well, I kind of answer that, but it's a very responsible auction
Yes,
house.
I know it is. Yes.
And now they're considered one of the top John F. Kennedy auction firms in America. And Christie's, they were very anxious to get it, and I respect them. But I said, no, Boston is much better than traveling down to New York every 5 seconds.
Now, the contents of this, you've been so kind to share with me and send me pages, which, of course, I have not had a chance to go through, but I am going to, after we're done, too, I'm going to continue with some of the wonderful observations that young John Kennedy had especially of the United Nations and of people's attitude who never fought in the war and were pretty selfish with their own wishes rather than to be cognizant of what so many people went through that actually were in the war. But of the contents there, Deirdre, what would you say some of the key things that stuck out in your mind? Well,
I think his insight into the future of the United Nations, which he was in at the opening session in San Francisco.
Correct.
In 1945. He was hired by the Hearst newspapers to cover the conference before he went to Europe. And I think some of the words that he said at the time, and I'm going to quote what he said just briefly. The conference at San Francisco suffered from inadequate preparation and lack of fundamental agreement among the big three. And then he says, and there's a lot more, but this is just the most appropriate. In practice, I doubt that it will prove effective in the sense of its elaborate mechanics being frequently employed or vitally decisive in determining war or peace. That strikes me as very insightful given the history of the United Nations and the experience today.
Absolutely. And that's why I started, I don't know if you heard the beginning of the program, but I always continue in 20-plus years of being on the radio about that quote that's been attributed to different people about those who do not learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. And that, as we were talking, World War I was so poorly adjudicated by the powers afterwards that it allowed Germany to fester and created basically Hitler.
That's right.
And here, in his observations, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but he was, I think, cognizant of the same potential in the United Nations that they had not changed.
They haven't.
Yeah, and look at what's happened since.
Right. Now, the other thing that I think is very striking is remember, he's 28 years old.
Right.
When he's writing the diary, and he will be president in 16 years.
Unbelievable.
And this is his last free foray into the world before his father had, after his brother was killed in World War II in 1944. JFK was picked by his father to be his successor in running for the presidency.
Correct.
And running for politics first, and then running for office, and then presidency. And I think one of the most interesting quotes in the diary is when he says, a clash, when he's speaking of the dangers of war, because he had a abhorrence of war. He says, a clash may be finally and indefinitely postponed by the discovery of a weapon so horrible that it will truthfully mean the abolishment of all nations employing it. And he didn't know officially, even though he was traveling with Navy Secretary James Forrestal.
Forrestal, right.
And he didn't know about the atomic, that he was about.
At that time, right. Isn't
well,
that
until he got to Potsdam. And then
that's right.
Now, so that to me is very insightful.
Oh, it certainly is.
The other thing I would point out to your listeners is that he foresaw, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was very, very, he was the one of the historians, Professor Sheldon Stern, who spent 20 years at the Kennedy Presidential Library as chief historian. And Professor Sheldon Stern says, and I'm quoting him, the decision to compromise by trading the Soviet missiles in Cuba for the U.S. missiles in Turkey was President Kennedy's alone. And that, of course, was what kept us from thermonuclear war in 1962.
Oh, positively. And remember, but for him, who was the admiral that wanted us really to go to war?
Well, Curtis LeMay.
Yes. And Deirdre, just interrupting a little, I can remember being up at the University of Massachusetts in my fraternity, Kappa Sigma. I was just graduating, and I'd gotten my ROTC sheet of graduated into ROTC, and we watched television in our television room at the fraternity in Amherst, and watched those ships heading to Cuba, to set up the barricade, not knowing if we were all going to end up in the service and going to war.
Absolutely.
That was really a very, very scary time,
Right, and he had the insight with all these cabinet members, McNamara, Rusk, Nitzer. Paul Nitzer was key. They all wanted to send nuclear weapons down to Cuba.
Right, I know.
And that would have been devastation. I was in the State Department at the time, and I could remember everything was top secret. We couldn't open our mouths up, and I didn't. Even though Roger Hilsman, my boss, was one of the key architects.
Diedrich, excuse me. Can you stay on? We've got to interrupt and come back in 10 minutes. Is that all right?
Surely.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks so much. It's the Don McCaig Show, ladies and gentlemen. We're here with Deidre Henderson. We're talking about JFK. We'll be back.
It's only going to be 4 minutes, not 10.
Okay.
I wish it was 10. That means we'd be making a lot of money.
We got a few more. We're back, ladies and gentlemen. We're going back to Deidre Henderson, who has the only, I believe, diary ever kept by President John Fitzgerald Kennedy when it was 1945, when he was a reporter for the Hearst newspapers, and it is going to be auctioned at R&R Auction House this Wednesday, April 26th in Boston. Deidre, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
Thanks for waiting. I'm sorry to get interrupted.
That's all right.
Where would you like to go? Do you want to tell any our listeners, hopefully, how they could possibly participate, or is it going to be open to the public?
Anyone could call into the auction house.
Because I don't have a number to give out. I don't know if you do, but
I can. But let me give you. Let me just wait a minute and get the main number for our auction.
Okay.
And then we maybe somebody from RR who's listening, hopefully, will call in and give a more specific.
Oh, okay.
But this is a main number for the auction house. It's in the warehouse, is the main office. One of the main offices is in New Hampshire.
Okay.
603
right
732 4280.
Okay, that's 603
732 4280.
4280.
Oh, and then the person has to the person who wants to bid has to call in ahead of time and register.
Okay.
It's a live auction, and it will be and I can, later on, before the auction, I can give you a more specific number. But that will work for calling in.
Now, I would think that this would have worldwide interest, especially with the 100th birthday of John Kennedy coming up this next month.
That's correct. That's right.
So I can't tell you how much it means for me to have you on as a friend and a former customer at the Crane Brook.
Thank you. That was a wonderful place.
Oh, it was a wonderful place. But now, what else would we like? There's so much to cover, but I mean...
Let me think.
Go ahead.
One thing that I think the reason it will be of interest worldwide, and probably, is because there's been a lot of press in Europe. And... it shows that John F. Kennedy, when he ran for Congress in 1946 and won, that he was already, he didn't just begin politics and then become president. He was a young man who was exceptionally bright, very, very well read in history. He had traveled all over the world with his family and alone. And his father, Ambassador Kennedy, who was sometimes very much maligned, but Ambassador Kennedy gave, particularly his sons, a lot of freedom to learn about the world and study without being told what to think, even though the ambassador was an isolationist.
Right.
And one of JFK's biggest idols as a young man, he was caught when he was very ill when he was young.
That's right, which is where he got all the reading, right? Yeah.
He did a lot of reading.
Right.
And his greatest idol was Winston Churchill.
That's right. He loved Winston Churchill.
And so one of his finest hours was April 9th, 1963, when he, with others, succeeded in making Churchill an honorary citizen of the United States. Just let me read you one passage, if you have time.
Sure.
That shows his great respect, and this is in the Rose Garden. Sir Winston couldn't be there; he was too ill. But his son Randolph was there, and his grandson Winston was there. And he says, JFK says, President Kennedy, I should say, says, in the dark days and darker nights, when Britain stood alone, and most men, save Englishmen, despaired of England's life, he mobilized the English language and sent it into battle. The incandescent quality of his words illuminated the courage of his countrymen. That's very moving.
That's fabulous. And it was so well-deserved. And, of course, Winston despised Mr. Kennedy because of his position of defeatism. Deidre, we have another break. Now, I don't know if you would like to come back, or you can call back, or stay on, whichever you'd like to do.
I'll stay on and read and not and listen to, of course, listen to the ads.
Well, I'd love to have you stay as long as you'd feel, because I find this, and I know our listeners will find this extremely interesting.
How long is this break?
This is about, 5 minutes, 6 minutes?
No, this is about 8 minutes.
Eight maybe.
Okay, what I'm going to do is...
That's why I said you could call back.
When do you want me to call back? Give me a time.
Call back at, 10 past would be good.
Fine, and I'll get a better auction number for people.
Okay, that's great.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. It's the Don McCaig Show, ladies and gentlemen, and we have a wonderful guest that has been joining us, who was the research assistant for President John F. Kennedy, even when he was a senator. We'll be back. Paul in Fort Benning, you hold on. I'll try to get to you as soon as I can. It's 95 WXTK. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Don McCaig Show. A special treat today is a review of this Wednesday's auction of a diary owned by Ms. Deirdre Henderson, who will join us again. John Kennedy in 1962 said the following, quote, "A man does what he must in spite of personal consequences, in spite of obstacles and dangers and pressures, and that is the basis of all human morality." Let's go to Paul in Fort Benning for holding all this time, Paul. I hope you're going to be on this subject. That's the only thing, because Deirdre is going to be calling back.
Absolutely. Am I on now?
You're there. Thanks so much for holding.
Not a problem. I was calling actually in regard, you were talking about JFK's stance on the nuclear option and his geopolitical kind of agenda.
Right.
I was calling with a hypothetical regarding what LBJ did in response to the whole escalation to the Vietnam War, the engagement with the USS Maddox, and the subsequent naval engagements that led to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Now, LBJ took a stance, went into the country, started with an air campaign against Vietnam, which escalated to full-out war. But in the end, we never really put the full amount of resources in necessary to finish this war. How do you believe JFK would have handled this? Would he have used diplomatic options, or attempted to use diplomatic options, or would he have gone in with a similar strength, or would he have really gone in with an all-out war policy, focused more on China's support of the NBA? And
yeah, well, that's been kicked around, but I honestly believe he would have seen the futility of it. I think we would have gotten out of it rather than escalate. But there were also stories, again, of assassination attempts on the leadership in Vietnam, as there were in, of course, and it's been verified, about trying to assassinate Castro in Cuba. So I don't know, Paul. I think the jury's always going to be out there. People, of course, that are fans of President Kennedy, and I'm one, but I try to be objective. I think they would like to think that he would have pulled us, would have seen the futility of it, as the French did. Charles de Gaulle warned President Kennedy and warned Johnson of the futility of the Vietnam conflict, because France lost millions and lost a lot of lives and accomplished nothing. But of course, the big thing is the motivation, and the motivation was pure, and that is to try to stop the spread of communism, Yes,
absolutely. I agree. But also in regard, we took more of a let's try and clog every hole in the old broken dam
Right.
response to fighting the Vietnam War rather than building a new dam behind it and cutting off all the water. And that water would be China's support and Russia's, to a lesser extent, of the communist faction within Vietnam. Now, I'm not sure if, it would have been a difficult task in order to cut that off, but do you believe through sanctions or nuclear threat we could have at least stemmed some of that support, some of the men, the weapons, the stuff, everything that NBA war machine needed to keep on going in order to stop that? Do you believe JFK would have accomplished that, or would he have?
I don't know. You see, those were different times. Like, one of the things that I really like so much about President Donald Trump is he is, I believe, doing the greatest thing that we've had in a long time, and that is he is providing open lines of communication to China. He's had the Chinese, representatives over here, all the time. He's also had a business relationship with China, and every country wants a strong economy. It's extremely important to every country, whether they're communist or not. And I think that John Kennedy would have attempted at least to do some diplomacy behind the scenes. But again, as I say, it's all supposition, Paul. But thank you.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for holding, and thank you very much for your nice input here.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Have a wonderful day.
Thanks so much. Thanks. Keep listening. 775 WX. 508-775-9985 or 1-888-WXTK-951. We probably won't get to you because the lovely Deirdre Henderson is back on. Hello there.
Hello.
Oh, welcome back, Deirdre. I hope were you able to get any further information?
Yes, I did.
Good.
The call for the phone number for people to call to bid at the auction, the live auction, they'd have to call in and register to bid, and that number is 1-800-937-3880.
Try that again so the people can grab their pen or pencil.
Oh, yes.
Yep.
To bid on the auction, 1-800-937-3880.
Now, you were also kind enough to send me you have put together a catalog, by the way. This is why I wanted to bring this up. Oh, the beautiful picture. My God, he looks like he's about 16 years old behind his typewriter.
Right. He was still at Harvard then.
He was still at Harvard, yeah. And it says a diary from the summer of 1945. And then there are pictures. And, of course, there are printed sheets as to the things he said, which you have mentioned and I'll mention. But now, what's about the availability of our listeners to get one of those catalogs? Are they available to buy or to?
We have them on PDF.
Okay.
And so they can ask for one of those when they call in, or they can call the auction house itself. But I think the best and quickest way would be to call into that 800 phone number.
Right.
And the PDF will be available.
I think that's fabulous. Well, now tell me again, what were you, I hate to bring this up, but were you working still for the president when he was killed? No,
I had been in the White House in 1961 as staff.
Oh, yes.
But I stayed there for less than a year. I was helping, I was working with Sergeant Shriver on the Peace Corps. My office was in the old executive office building, and I was working on some civil rights issues. Then the president, when I went into the Oval Office, he called me in once. I was there several times, but he asked me this time, he said, I want you to go over to the State Department and to work for my close friend, Roger Hilsman, who was then director of the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. And he said, I want to make the State Department into a meaningful department, which I thought was significant.
Yeah, it most certainly is. Well, he saw again the failings of which we still see in the state. Yeah, in the bureaucracy and
right.
in the appointments of people to the State Department with very little, if any, qualifications, right?
Well, a lot of them were very well qualified.
Yes, they were. But
they were foreign service officers, but there were in those days you called them cookie pushers.
Yes.
In other words, but the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, I was very, very fortunate to be assigned there because the president, first of all, one of my assignments was to go to every news conference he had, the president, and he would come to the State Department, and I'd rush down there with somebody else that did the same thing for another department at State, and you know, and if he saw you, he'd wave to you, which was kind of nice too.
Yes.
And then he would call. He didn't call the chief of divisions. He would call, say, the head of the Laos division. And the Bureau of Intelligence and Research was many, many parts, and they were all experts in their field of whatever country they were following, whether it was Vietnam or Laos or Cambodia, whatever it was. But he would call the desk chief for those departments, of those pieces of,
right.
And the morale was absolutely incredible. The President of the United States called and asked what I thought, you know, before he went into the news conference.
Well, you just mentioned, you know, I lived in Hyannisport for 10-plus years, and I was the neighbor of the Shrivers, and I thought the world of Sergeant Shriver, and I liked Eunice very much also.
Oh, she was wonderful.
Yeah, and but Sergeant, of course, was appointed to be the head of the Peace Corps, and one of the things that I'm sure you'll agree, and I'm so glad to get an opportunity right now for our listeners to hear it, is I think too little has been attributed to the kind of person President Kennedy was by creating the Peace Corps.
Right.
And how that gave, you know, what we could use is a Peace Corps almost now a requirement of our young people. Some of these people that are out there protesting the sitting president, they do well.
And living off drugs.
Yeah, and living off drugs. But they do well to serve some time in these foreign countries that we do so much for, and so many people who are members of the Peace Corps brought about such a great feeling for America from these countries, Deidre,
exactly.
Right? And that was his idea, and it was, you know, I think history has never really, I believe, promoted that part of his presidency enough.
Not enough, no. But except people should read Thurston Clarke's book, JFK's Last 100 Days. And Thurston Clarke believed that well, he says the subtitle to his book is The Transformation of a Man and the Emergence of a Great President. And Thurston Clarke this book is tops, as far as I'm concerned, as one of the best books on his presidency.
Right.
Thurston Clarke, Clarke, in the JFK's Last 100 Days. And Thurston Clarke believed that he really, and I saw this in some ways too, that he liked the little man as much as he liked, meeting with lords and ladies and kings and queens. He really liked, for example, his chauffeur in Washington, Muggsy. There's a great picture that someone showed me years ago of JFK with a beer can in his hand and going off. And JFK was not a heavy drinker, by the way.
No.
Occasionally, as Dave Powers would say, we had a Heineken's together. You know.
He liked the only thing I heard that he liked, and I had one with Stephen Smith down in Palm Beach, was daiquiris. He used to enjoy a daiquiri. Yeah.
Right, but he wasn't, because he once.
His stomach was bad. He couldn't drink much anyway, so he
drank
said.
Milkshakes and everything. But and shall I tell your listeners one funny story, and then you better let them ask me questions.
Yep.
But this is one of my assignments. It wasn't a dull job, just going to the libraries and working with professors and reading their books and intellectual. In fact, he asked me to put on a cocktail party for his academics because they were working hard. And so I had a friend who loaned me an apartment, and every time I didn't want to go back to the North Shore at night, I would stay on Beacon Hill. And he said, would you give me a party So I bought the liquor, his father's liquor store down in the North End.
Yeah.
And I bought all the best liquor. I think the bill was just a mere $45, but in those days. And I invited everybody, and Governor Peabody was governor then, and I thought, why the devil are they all coming? Well, they were coming because they knew he was going to be the next president of the United States. So I had this, and I even had a bartender. First cocktail party I'd ever given. And then I said, Senator, what would you like to drink? And he said, ginger ale. And I thought, oh, my God, why'd I bother to get all that expensive liquor?
Isn't that something? He drank ginger ale. He was.
And then he said, when he was going, the cocktail party lasted a long time. And I walked out with him naturally, and he had an apartment down the road a piece. And I said, Senator, can I ask you a favor? And he, sure. And I said, I'm not learning enough about politics. I'm learning about, the world and everything. But could I come to the convention? And it didn't take him more than a split second to say yes if you go to spend half your time at the Rand Corporation and the other half helping my top staff at the convention. What an assignment.
Wow.
So he was very kind that way. He would think, and then he would, he would really think of other people. Like when I was visiting him in the Oval Office, and he said, "Have you found an apartment yet?" I said, "No, I'm looking hard in Georgetown." And he said, "Well, call up Mrs. Kennedy's social secretary." And I did, and I got an apartment within, a house to rent within minutes.
Well,
but there's the President of the United States thinking of somebody else.
Well, that's what I found in my friend Teddy, and of course, it's so sad that they're also. There's another side that the media and others who dislike the Kennedys have trumpeted for a lot of years, and rightly or not rightly, it's a shame because it I think overshadows too often the accomplishments of both of them as people too.
Right.
So. But listen, I'll let you go, Deidre, and I certainly hope that.
And if you have any questions, be sure and let them through now if you want to.
Sure. Well, that's perfectly fine. I mean, we could continue. I think it's probably of great interest to people. I just didn't want to.
No, I'm fine. It's Saturday.
Well, I didn't want to encourage the other side, if you know what I mean.
Right.
You know what I mean? We didn't discuss this. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
But you know what I mean.
Anyway. One thing I would like to mention before you leave is in Europe, when the diary was first announced, it was said, everybody in the press, not everybody, but some of them in the press, pointed out his statement that the stuff of what he said in his last sentence in the diary was the stuff of which legends are made. Hitler was the stuff of which legends are made. And of course, he said that, yes, but he also, I researched that statement very carefully, and he wasn't referring to the fact that he was a great legend. He was referring to the fact that, he had boundless energy, yes, but there's nowhere in history that in his history that shows that he was an admirer of Hitler.
Of course.
But the press
Attila the Hun is a legend. I mean, you can name hundreds of legends that were not good people,
Exactly.
Well, listen, we'll let you go, and I'll talk to you after the show, too, I hope, and thank you so much.
You're welcome. I appreciate your time.
Oh, I love it, and the best of luck with the auction, and I'm sure it's going to be a huge turnout.
Well, I think it's going to be shown to the world as opposed to be stuck in some library.
Well, we'll do lunch pretty darn soon after the fact, and you can fill me in on that.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Deidre.
Bye-bye.
Deidre Henderson.
Yeah, and she'll be paying for the lunch, too.
Former research assistant and a good friend of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who would have been 100 years old this next month, May 29th. It's the Don McCaig Show. Lots more to come. Stay with us.